"I'm waiting for my son," the old woman said softly, and the entire bus stop seemed to fall silent around her. Nobody laughed. Nobody asked another question. They just stared for a moment before looking away, the way people often do when they don't know what to do with someone else's sadness. Every morning at exactly 7:12 a.m., Maya Johnson arrived at the same bus stop on the corner of Oakwood Avenue and Madison Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. It didn't matter if the summer sun baked the sidewalk until heat shimmered above the pavement. It didn't matter if icy winds swept through the city in January, turning every breath into a cloud of white mist. It didn't matter if rain hammered the metal shelter roof so loudly that conversations became impossible. Maya came anyway. She always came. The bus stop itself wasn't remarkable. A faded blue bench sat beneath a scratched plexiglass shelter covered with old advertisements and weathered community notices. Most people barely noticed it. Commuters rushed past with coffee cups in hand. Students checked their phones while waiting for rides. Delivery trucks rumbled by. Life moved forward every day around that small corner of the city. But Maya never seemed to move with it. She would arrive carrying the same brown leather handbag and the same silver thermos. She would settle carefully onto the bench, smooth the wrinkles from her coat, and look down the road stretching toward the horizon. Then she would wait. Some mornings she stayed for an hour. Other mornings she remained until noon. Nobody knew exactly what determined when she finally stood and walked away. People simply accepted that she would be there. Over time, she became part of the scenery, like the old oak tree nearby or the newspaper stand across the street. Store owners nodded when they saw her. Bus drivers recognized her face. Local residents knew her by sight, even if they didn't know her name. They called her different things. The waiting woman. The bus stop lady. Some assumed she was lonely. Others quietly wondered if she was confused. A few felt sorry for her. None of them knew the truth. One chilly October morning, a new city bus driver pulled up to the stop for the first time. His name was Daniel Carter. 45 years old, broad-shouldered, kind-eyed, and recently transferred from another route. Daniel noticed Maya immediately. While passengers boarded, he watched her sitting perfectly still beneath the shelter. She wasn't reading. She wasn't scrolling through a phone. She wasn't watching traffic. She was simply looking down the road as though expecting someone. The next morning she was there again. And the morning after that. By the end of the week, Daniel found himself searching for her before he even reached the intersection. Somehow, seeing her sitting there made the route feel familiar. On Friday, after dropping off passengers, he finally stepped down from the bus and approached the bench. Maya looked up as his shadow crossed the sidewalk. Her dark eyes were calm and warm despite the cool morning air. Daniel offered a polite smile. "Ma'am," he said, glancing down the empty road. "Can I ask you something?" Maya returned the smile. "Of course." Daniel hesitated for a second. It felt oddly personal, yet he couldn't stop himself. "Who are you waiting for?" Maya looked past him toward the distant curve of the street. For a moment, sunlight caught the silver strands in her hair. Then she answered with a voice so gentle it was almost carried away by the wind. "My son." Daniel did not know why the answer stayed with him for the rest of the day. He had spoken to hundreds of passengers over the years. People shared stories, complaints, jokes, and sometimes pieces of their lives. Most of those conversations faded by the end of a shift. But Maya Johnson's words followed him long after he finished his route. "My son." There had been no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. She had spoken with the quiet confidence of someone stating a simple fact. The following Monday, Daniel arrived at the intersection a few minutes earlier than usual. Morning sunlight spilled across the storefront windows, turning the glass gold. A cool breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee from a nearby bakery. Maya was already there. She sat in the same spot beneath the shelter, her silver thermos resting beside her. Daniel slowed the bus slightly as he approached. Through the windshield, he could see her watching the road again. Waiting. That afternoon, during a break between routes, Daniel found himself mentioning her to another driver. The older man chuckled softly. "The lady at Oakwood?" he asked. "She has been there forever." "You know her?" Daniel asked. "Not really," the man replied. "Nobody does. She just shows up every day. Rain, snow, heat waves. Makes no difference." Daniel frowned. "How long?" The driver shrugged. "Maybe 15 years. Maybe more." I stopped counting. The answer unsettled him. 15 years was a long time to wait for anything. The next morning, he stepped off the bus again. Maya greeted him with the same warm smile. Good morning, Daniel. He blinked in surprise. You remembered my name. You told me on Friday. She tapped her temple gently. I have always had a good memory. Daniel laughed. Apparently better than mine. For a few moments they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, traffic, the bakery across the street. Maya seemed easy to talk to. There was nothing strange about her at all. In fact, she reminded Daniel of the women who had filled his childhood neighborhood. Patient, thoughtful, strong in a quiet way. Yet every few seconds her eyes drifted back toward the road. It was almost automatic, as though some invisible thread kept pulling her attention forward. Finally, Daniel asked the question he had been carrying all weekend. How long have you been waiting? Maya looked down at her hands. Her fingers rested lightly on the silver thermos. For a moment, she seemed to measure the answer. 18 years. The noise of passing traffic faded in Daniel's ears. 18 years. Nearly 2 decades. He glanced toward the road, then back at her. Every day. Maya nodded. Almost every day. That is a very long time. A faint smile touched her face. A mother does not stop being a mother because time passes. Daniel had no response to that. He simply stood there while morning sunlight filtered through the shelter roof, creating small patterns of light across the bench. Maya reached into her handbag and carefully removed a worn photograph. The edges had softened. With age. She looked at it for a few seconds before returning it to the bag. Daniel only caught a brief glimpse. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Dark curls, bright eyes, smiling directly at the camera. Is that him? Daniel asked quietly. Maya nodded. His name is Michael. The way she said the name made it sound alive. Present. As though he might appear around the corner at any moment. The bus behind Daniel sounded its horn, reminding him that passengers were waiting. He checked his watch and reluctantly stepped backward toward the vehicle. I should get going. Maya smiled again. You have people to take where they need to be. Daniel climbed aboard and closed the door. As the bus pulled away, he glanced into the mirror. Maya remained on the bench, her gaze fixed down the road. The photograph was back inside her handbag. The thermos rested beside her. Everything looked exactly the same as before. Yet for the first time, Daniel realized she was not simply waiting. She was holding on to something the rest of the world had long ago decided to let go. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself looking forward to the stop more than any other part of his route. The city changed around him every day. New construction appeared. Businesses opened and closed. Seasons shifted. But Maya remained constant, like the steady ticking of a clock that never missed a beat. One crisp November morning, he arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. As he stepped off the bus, the air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting from distant neighborhoods. Maya smiled the moment she saw the extra cup. You did not have to do that, she said. I know, Daniel replied, handing it to her. But I figured waiting is easier with coffee. A quiet laugh escaped her lips. It was warm and genuine, the kind that made a person seem 20 years younger for a moment. They sat together on the bench while passengers came and went around them. Daniel learned that Maya had worked as a librarian for nearly 30 years before retiring. He learned that she loved old jazz records and lemon pound cake. He learned that every Christmas she still decorated her apartment. Window with white lights because Michael had once told her they looked like stars. What surprised him most was how rarely she spoke about herself. Nearly every story somehow led back to her son. Not in a way that felt obsessive. Not in a way that felt unhealthy. Simply because Michael remained woven into every memory she carried. One afternoon, after finishing his shift, Daniel stopped by a small diner near the transit station. A few veteran drivers were gathered around a corner booth. During the conversation, he mentioned Maya again. An older woman named Linda looked up from her tea. You were spending time with the lady at Oakwood? She asked. Daniel nodded. She is a good person. Linda's expression softened. She always was. Daniel leaned forward. You know her? A little, Linda said. Years ago, before I became a driver, I worked at the downtown library. Maya worked there too. Daniel listened carefully. What happened? Linda stared out the window for a moment. One day her son disappeared. Nobody expected it. He was a bright kid. Sweet. Polite. Then suddenly he was gone. Daniel felt his chest tighten. They never found him. Linda slowly shook her head. People searched. Police searched. Volunteers searched. The whole community hoped for answers. She lowered her eyes. Eventually, life moved on for everyone except Maya. The words stayed with Daniel long after the conversation ended. That evening, he drove home through streets glowing beneath amber streetlights. Rain had begun falling lightly, tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm. He kept thinking about the photograph, about the way Maya spoke Michael's name, about 18 years of waiting. Most people would have stopped believing. Most people would have accepted uncertainty as the final answer. Yet somehow Maya had not. The next morning, he arrived at the bus stop earlier than usual. Rainwater still clung to the shelter roof from the storm overnight. Maya was already there. A gray blanket rested across her lap. Tiny drops of water sparkled on the edges of the bench. Daniel sat beside her without speaking. For several minutes, neither of them said a word. Cars hissed across wet pavement. A city bus turned the corner 2 blocks away. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang 8 times. Finally, Maya reached into her handbag again and removed the photograph. This time she handed it to him. Daniel studied the picture more carefully than before. Michael looked happy. His smile was wide and fearless. Around his neck hung a small silver necklace with a circular pendant. He wore this every day, Maya said quietly. Daniel looked closer. Something about the pendant felt strangely familiar. He could not explain why. It was only a simple piece of jewelry. Yet as he stared at it, an odd sensation settled over him, as though he were looking at something he had seen before in another life. He handed the photograph back slowly, unaware that the small detail he had just noticed would soon change everything he thought he knew about his own past. That evening, Daniel could not stop thinking about the photograph. He sat alone at his kitchen table while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the apartment. Outside, cold November rain tapped against the windows. The framed photographs on his bookshelf caught the glow of a nearby lamp, throwing long shadows across the room. Normally after work, he would watch a game, read a little, then head to bed. Tonight was different. His thoughts kept returning to the silver pendant hanging around Michael's neck. There was nothing extraordinary about it. A simple circular design. Yet every time he pictured it, a strange feeling stirred somewhere deep inside him. Daniel stood and walked toward the hallway closet. After a moment of hesitation, he reached to the top shelf and pulled down a small wooden box. The hinges creaked softly as he opened it. Inside were a few personal keepsakes he had carried for most of his life. Old report cards, a faded birthday card from his adoptive mother, a handful of photographs, and resting beneath them all was a silver necklace. Daniel froze. Slowly, he lifted it into the light. The pendant was almost identical to the one in Michael's photograph. His pulse quickened. He turned it over in his fingers. The metal had worn smooth after years of use. He had owned it for as long as he could remember. In fact, it was the only object that had come with him before his adoption. Growing up, he had asked countless questions about where it came from. His adoptive parents had never known the answer. They had told him only what the paperwork said. He had been found alone as a child in another state. No family had been identified. No relatives had ever come forward. Eventually, Daniel stopped asking questions. Life moved on. School, work, marriage, then divorce, a career driving buses. Ordinary years filled with ordinary routines. Yet now, sitting alone beneath the warm kitchen light, he found himself staring at the necklace with new eyes. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray above Charlotte. Daniel arrived at the bus stop carrying the pendant in his jacket pocket. Maya was already there, wrapped in her coat against the cold. Steam drifted from her thermos into the crisp air. For several minutes they spoke casually. Neither mentioned Michael. Neither mentioned the photograph. But Daniel could feel the weight of the necklace against his chest. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, he reached into his pocket. Maya, he said carefully, can I ask you something? She looked at him. Of course. Daniel opened his hand. The silver pendant rested in his palm. For a moment Maya did not move. The traffic noise seemed to disappear. The distant sounds of the city faded into silence. Her eyes locked onto the necklace. Daniel watched the color drain from her face. Very slowly, Maya reached forward. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the pendant. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she stared as though afraid the object might disappear if she blinked. Where did you get this? She whispered. Daniel swallowed. I have had it my whole life. Maya's hand covered her mouth. Tears instantly filled her eyes. The wind tugged gently at the edges of her coat, but she seemed completely unaware of it. Michael had one exactly like this, she said. There were only two. Daniel felt a chill run through him despite the heavy jacket he wore. Two. Maya nodded slowly. I bought them when he was little. One for me. One for him. She opened her handbag with shaking hands and removed a small leather wallet. From a hidden compartment, she pulled another necklace. The moment it appeared, Daniel's heart began pounding. The pendants matched perfectly. Same shape, same engraving, same tiny scratch near the edge. Maya stared from one necklace to the other. Then she looked up at Daniel with an expression he could not quite understand. Hope, fear, disbelief, all woven together. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The city continued moving around them. Cars passed. Buses arrived and departed. People hurried along the sidewalk. Yet inside that small bus shelter, time seemed to stand completely still. Daniel barely noticed when the next bus arrived. Passengers stepped on and off. The doors opened and closed. Engines rumbled. Conversations drifted through the cold morning air. Yet neither he nor Maya seemed aware of any of it. Their attention remained fixed on the two matching pendants resting side by side between them. Maya's eyes glistened with tears she was no longer trying to hide. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something reassuring, something logical, but no words came. Too many questions crowded his mind. Finally, Maya drew a slow breath. When were you adopted? She asked softly. Daniel sat down beside her on the bench. I was told I was around 9 years old. Maya lowered her eyes. Michael had been 9 when he disappeared. The coincidence settled heavily between them. Do you remember anything? She asked. Daniel stared toward the road. For years he had rarely thought about his earliest memories. His adoptive parents had been loving people. They had given him stability, encouragement, and a home. Looking backward had never seemed important. But now those forgotten years felt different. Important. Necessary. Not much, he admitted. Just fragments. Maya listened without interrupting. I remember a woman singing sometimes. Daniel rubbed his forehead as he searched through memories that felt buried beneath decades of ordinary life. I remember books. Lots of books. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Her fingers tightened around the pendant in her hand. I worked at a library, she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. I know. Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. And I remember lemon cake. Maya suddenly looked at him. Lemon pound cake. Daniel blinked. Yes. A small sound escaped Maya's lips. Half laugh. Half sob. It was his favorite. Daniel felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. None of these details proved anything. He knew that. Memories were unreliable. People connected random facts all the time. Yet the pieces were beginning to form a picture neither of them could ignore. Over the following days, their conversations became longer. Daniel adjusted his brakes whenever possible so he could spend more time at the bus stop. Together, they compared memories. Maya showed him old family photographs she had carried for years. Some featured Michael standing beside a Christmas tree decorated with white lights. Others showed him holding library books nearly as large as his arms. Daniel studied every image carefully. Certain places seemed familiar. Certain expressions felt strangely recognizable. One afternoon, Maya brought an old photo album. The pages crackled softly as they turned them beneath the shelter. Daniel paused on one picture. Michael stood beside a large oak tree. Behind him sat a small brick church with stained glass windows. A sudden image flashed through Daniel's mind. Bright colors. Church bells. A warm spring afternoon. The memory vanished almost immediately, but it left him shaken. What is it? Maya asked. Daniel pointed at the photograph. I think I remember that place. Maya stared at him. Neither spoke for several seconds. Later that evening, Daniel drove across town to visit the church from the picture. The building still stood exactly where it had decades earlier. As he stepped from his truck, cold wind rustled the branches overhead. He walked slowly across the grass. The closer he came to the old oak tree, the stronger the feeling became. Not certainty, not proof, just familiarity, like hearing a song from childhood and recognizing the melody before remembering the lyrics. He stood there until sunset painted the sky orange and gold. Then he looked down at the silver pendant hanging from his neck. For the first time in his life, Daniel found himself wondering whether the story he had always believed about his beginnings was incomplete. And somewhere across the city, Maya sat alone beside her apartment window beneath strands of white Christmas lights she never stopped hanging each year. 18 years of waiting had taught her to be careful with hope. Hope could heal. Hope could also break a heart. Yet as she looked at the matching pendant resting in her palm, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt the possibility that tomorrow might finally bring an answer. Winter arrived quietly across Charlotte. The mornings grew darker. Frost gathered along the edges of rooftops. Bare tree branches stretched across pale skies like charcoal lines drawn against the horizon. Yet every day Maya remained faithful to her routine. At 7:12 each morning she arrived at the bus stop, carrying her thermos and her hope. Daniel continued meeting her whenever his schedule allowed. Neither of them spoke openly about what they both feared to say. The possibility felt too fragile, too important. One careless assumption could shatter it. Instead, they focused on facts. A week later, Daniel requested copies of the documents connected to his adoption. The process took time. Several phone calls led to more paperwork. Old records had been moved between agencies over the years. Some files were archived. Others had been digitized. While he waited, he found himself noticing details he had ignored for decades. Certain memories surfaced unexpectedly. A familiar scent, a phrase, a melody. One afternoon while driving his route, he heard an elderly passenger softly humming a gospel song. The sound hit him like a gust of wind. Suddenly, he remembered sitting beside a woman with warm hands while she sang that exact tune. The image lasted only seconds before fading again. That evening he called Maya. "Did you ever sing to Michael?" he asked. Silence lingered on the line. Then Maya answered softly. "Every night." Daniel swallowed. "Do you remember which songs?" Maya began naming them. By the third title, Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. He knew every word. Days later, a thick envelope finally arrived. Daniel carried it to the bus stop instead of opening it alone. Maya was waiting beneath the shelter when he arrived. Snow flurries drifted lazily through the air. The envelope felt unusually heavy in his hands. Maya looked at it, but said nothing. Daniel sat beside her on the bench. Together they stared at the sealed package. Neither seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, Daniel opened it. Inside were photocopied reports, intake forms, and old administrative records. He carefully turned each page. Most contained routine information, dates, locations, processing notes. Then he stopped. His breath caught. One page contained a description of the personal belongings found with him. A silver necklace, a blue backpack, a small paperback book. Daniel stared at the final item. "A book," Maya whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is what it says." Maya's eyes widened. Michael carried the same book everywhere. She reached into her handbag and removed a photograph. In the image, a smiling boy sat beneath a library table holding a worn paperback against his chest. Daniel compared the picture to the document. The title matched exactly. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Snowflakes settled quietly on the shelter roof above them. The city seemed distant and muted beneath the gray afternoon sky. Daniel continued reading. Near the bottom of the page, another detail appeared. His eyes moved across the sentence twice before he fully understood it. Then he froze. The location where he had first entered the system was listed less than 30 miles from Charlotte. Less than 30 miles from the very place where Michael had vanished 18 years earlier. Maya covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Daniel felt his heart pounding harder than ever before. The evidence was no longer made of memories and coincidences alone. Real documents were beginning to point in the same direction. Yet neither celebrated. Neither rushed to conclusions. The truth still mattered too much. As daylight faded, they sat together in silence watching snow drift across the empty road. For the first time in 18 years, Maya no longer felt alone in her waiting. And for the first time in his life, Daniel realized he might finally be walking toward the answer that had been missing from his own story all along. The official confirmation arrived 3 weeks later. Until then, neither Daniel nor Maya spoke much about what the results might reveal. The waiting felt different now. For 18 years, Maya had waited with uncertainty. This time she waited with possibility, and somehow that was even harder. Every morning, she still came to the bus stop. Every morning, Daniel found a reason to stop and sit beside her for a few minutes. Winter settled deeper over Charlotte. The mornings arrived wrapped in pale light and cold air. Frost coated the edges of parked cars. The branches above the shelter stood bare against the sky. One Thursday morning, Daniel was halfway through his route when his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He normally ignored personal calls while working, but something made him glance at the screen during a scheduled stop. The testing agency. His heart immediately began racing. For the rest of the route, every traffic light felt longer than usual. Every mile seemed stretched. By the time his shift ended, his hands were trembling. He drove straight to the bus stop. Maya was there, exactly where she always was. She noticed his expression before he spoke a word. The silver thermos rested beside her. Steam drifted gently into the cold afternoon air. Daniel walked toward the bench holding a sealed envelope. Neither of them sat down immediately. For several seconds, they simply looked at one another. Maya's eyes searched his face. "It came?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. The sounds of the city seemed distant. A bus pulled away from the curb. Somewhere a siren echoed faintly. Neither noticed. Daniel lowered himself onto the bench and carefully opened the envelope. The paper crackled in his hands. He read the first line silently. Then he stopped. His vision blurred. Maya's breath caught. "Daniel," she whispered. He looked up. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. For a moment he could not speak. The words seemed trapped somewhere deep inside his chest. Finally, he managed a single sentence. "It is 99.9%. Maya stared at him. The world appeared to freeze. Her hands slowly rose to her mouth. "What does that mean?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. Daniel's smile trembled. "It means you are my mother." The thermos slipped from Maya's lap and rolled gently across the sidewalk. Neither noticed. Tears streamed down her face. 18 years of hope, grief, faith, and longing seemed to collapse into a single moment. Daniel stood. Maya stood. For a second, they simply looked at each other, both overwhelmed by the reality standing in front of them. Then Maya reached for him. Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. The embrace was quiet. There were no dramatic words, no grand speeches, only the sound of two people crying softly beneath a winter sky. Commuters passed nearby. A few glanced toward them before continuing on their way. None of them understood what had just happened. They did not know they were witnessing the end of an 18-year wait. Daniel closed his eyes as Maya held him. Memories flashed through his mind like scattered pieces finally finding their proper place. The songs, the library, the lemon pound cake, the necklace, the church, the warmth he had spent his entire life searching for without realizing it. Maya pressed a trembling hand against his cheek. "I knew it," she whispered through tears. "I never stopped believing." Daniel laughed softly despite the tears running down his face. "And I never knew why this place felt important." Maya looked toward the road she had watched for nearly 2 decades. The same road, the same corner, the same bench. Then she looked back at the man standing before her. "You came home," she said. And for the first time since he could remember, Daniel felt as though he finally understood where home truly was. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal to both of them. For years, Maya had imagined what she might say if this day ever came. She had rehearsed conversations in her mind while sitting at the bus stop through summer heat and winter cold. Yet now that Daniel stood beside her as her son, most of those imagined words seemed unnecessary. Simply being together was enough. One Saturday morning, Daniel drove Maya to the small apartment where he had lived for nearly a decade. The winter sun streamed through the windshield, painting soft bands of gold across the dashboard. Maya sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing toward him with a smile that seemed unable to leave her face. Every few minutes, she reached over and touched his arm as if reassuring herself that he was truly there. When they arrived, Daniel opened the front door and invited her inside. The apartment was modest but warm. Family photographs lined a bookshelf. A comfortable chair sat beside a window overlooking the street. Maya moved slowly through the rooms, taking everything in. She paused at photographs from Daniel's life. School pictures, graduation photos, vacation snapshots, ordinary moments she had missed. Her fingers brushed the edge of one frame. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were different tears. Not tears of loss, tears of gratitude. "You had a good life?" she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I was lucky." He led her toward the kitchen. Above a cabinet sat the same wooden box that had held the silver pendant for so many years. Maya stared at it for a moment. Such a small object, such a simple thing. Yet it had helped bring them back together. Later that afternoon, Daniel introduced Maya to people who mattered most in his life. Friends who had become family over the years welcomed her with warmth and curiosity. One by one they listened to the story, Some laughed. Others cried. All of them understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. News of the reunion quietly spread through the neighborhood. The librarians who had once worked beside Maya learned what had happened. Former co-workers called to congratulate her. Even a few bus drivers who had watched her sit at the stop for years stopped by to offer hugs and kind words. Everyone seemed amazed by the same thing. Maya had never stopped believing. One evening, as snow drifted gently outside her apartment window, Daniel asked a question that had lingered in his mind. Why did you keep coming back? Maya looked toward the distant glow of streetlights beyond the glass. The white Christmas lights still hung in her window, casting soft reflections across the room. She smiled gently. Because if Michael ever came looking for me, I wanted him to know exactly where to find me. Daniel lowered his eyes. Emotion tightened his throat. Maya continued. People told me to move on. They meant well. They wanted me to be happy again. She folded her hands in her lap. But hope was never the thing hurting me. Hope was what helped me keep living. Silence settled between them. Comfortable. Peaceful. Outside, snowflakes floated through the darkness. Inside, mother and son sat together, sharing time neither of them believed they would ever have. For 18 years, one had waited, and the other had unknowingly searched for answers he did not realize were missing. Now neither needed to search anymore. The empty places in their lives had finally begun to heal. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, tomorrow no longer felt like something Maya had to wait for. It felt like something she could finally look forward to. Spring arrived quietly in Charlotte. The last traces of winter disappeared from the sidewalks, and fresh green leaves returned to the trees lining Oakwood Avenue. The city looked brighter somehow. Warmer. More alive. On a clear Saturday morning, Daniel parked his truck a short distance from the familiar bus stop and stepped out into the gentle sunlight. The air carried the scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the place that had changed both of their lives. The shelter looked exactly the same. The faded blue bench remained beneath the weathered roof. Cars continued passing by. Buses still arrived on schedule. To everyone else, it was just another ordinary corner in the city. But to Daniel and Maya, it would never be ordinary again. Maya walked beside him, her silver hair glowing softly in the morning light. She carried her thermos as she always had, though today there was a difference. Her steps seemed lighter. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of endless uncertainty. Together they approached the bench. Daniel smiled when he noticed a small bouquet of flowers resting there. Someone from the neighborhood had left them earlier that morning. A simple card sat beside the bouquet. Welcome home. Maya read the words and gently pressed her hand against her heart. Tears filled her eyes once again. Over the past few months, she had cried more than she had during the previous 10 years. Yet these tears felt different. They came from gratitude instead of sorrow. Daniel sat beside her on the bench. For a while neither spoke. The city moved around them exactly as it always had. A young mother pushed a stroller across the intersection. An elderly man walked his dog along the sidewalk. A city bus stopped, picked up passengers, and continued down the road. Ordinary life continued unfolding all around them. Maya looked toward the road she had watched for 18 years. Then she smiled softly. You know something? She said. Daniel turned toward her. What? She laughed quietly. For the first time, I do not feel like I am waiting anymore. Daniel looked down at his hands. The silver pendant still rested around his neck. Maya wore the matching one beneath her sweater. 2 pieces finally reunited after nearly 2 decades apart. I think I understand now, Daniel said. Understand what? Maya asked. Daniel glanced around the bus stop. Why you kept coming back? Maya listened. Most people thought you were waiting for someone to arrive. He smiled gently. But really, you were protecting hope. Maya's eyes shimmered in the sunlight. She reached over and squeezed his hand. Neither needed to say anything else. The answer was written in every year she had spent sitting on that bench. Every rainy morning. Every snowy afternoon. Every summer day beneath the heat. Hope had brought her there. Hope had kept her there. And hope had been right. A warm breeze drifted through the shelter, rustling the leaves overhead. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang softly in the distance. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The sound felt familiar now, not because of a forgotten memory, because he finally knew where those memories belonged. When he opened his eyes again, Maya was smiling at the road. Not searching, not wondering, simply smiling. The same road she had. watched for 18 years now stretched into the distance beneath a bright blue sky. Cars passed. Buses rolled by. Life moved forward. But the bench remained. Quiet. Steady. Patient. Just as it always had. As the morning sun climbed higher above the city, mother and son sat together beneath the shelter without speaking. They did not need words anymore. The waiting was over. The searching was over. The answer had finally arrived. And in the gentle silence of that ordinary bus stop, surrounded by nothing more than sunlight, birdsong, and the hum of passing traffic, the sound of justice was not applause.